In 1863, 14 paintings by Francisco Goya were discovered inside his home, La Quinta del Sordo, the deaf man's villa. Painted directly onto the walls, these works were never meant for the public. They were private. Today, they are known as the Black Paintings. To understand how Goya arrived at the Black Paintings, we have to understand why he felt the need to paint them. At the beginning of Goya's career, he spent time with the intellectuals of his country, Spain. They introduced him to the ideals of the Enlightenment, and Goya began to share their opposition to religious fanaticism, superstition, the Inquisition, and religious orders. Goya was later appointed Lieutenant Director of Painting of the Academy of San Fernando and eventually became the king's Spanish court painter, spending his time painting portraits. However, when the French Revolution began, Charles IV suppressed Spain's Enlightenment ideas and removed the most advanced thinkers from public life. Goya's enlightened friends were persecuted. At the same time, he fell sick to what most assume was lead poisoning and nearly died. When he recovered, the world was quieter, not by choice, but because he had gone deaf. Goya, who loved conversation and music, found himself suddenly cut off from both. Adjusting to life without hearing at the age of 46 was the first of many dark moments in Goya's life, and his work went from elegant, playful scenes of nobility and peasantry to works titled Courtyard with Lunatics. In this image, the insane grapple with each other, rocking on the floor with strange expressions, fight with empty air, and crawl on the ground as a guard beats the grappling men in the center. The sunlight in the sky at the top of the painting is a direct contrast with the horror happening below. Goya wrote, "The work served to occupy my imagination, tormented as it is by contemplation of my sufferings." To art historian Arthur Danto, Courtyard with Lunatics marks a point in Goya's career where he moves from a world in which there are no shadows to one in which there is no light. A somber vision of human bodies without human reason. Goya viewed the asylums as no more than holes in the societal surface, small dumps into which the psychotic could be thrown without the smallest attempt to discover, classify, or treat the nature of their illness, a scene Goya witnessed firsthand in his hometown of Zaragoza. Eventually, his ideology evolved towards skepticism, and Goya went from trusting the enlightened ideals once shared with his friends to becoming a product of the current world that lost confidence in the intellectual capacity of men to regenerate their society and only found a dark world without ideals. This transition and evolution in his thinking occurred during the creation of a series of 80 prints titled Los Caprichos, a series depicting his satire and skepticism in the possibilities of man. He plays on the idiocracy of those around him and demonstrates a society in peril and falling behind the tail of reason, a country whose king is losing control and whose people are lost in their fanatic delusions. You can see him describe a society losing its grip on its people and its ideals. People believing that the teeth of hanged men are important for sorcery and that the victims of the Spanish Inquisition were fueled by the ignorant and the superstitious. You can feel Goya's frustration and begin to see his fascination with describing the world as filled with monsters that exist beside man. Goya intended for the viewer to understand that nothing could be done about it. After the series of etchings were released in a book for the public to purchase, things only became worse for Goya. Napoleon declared himself first consul of the French Republic and became increasingly interested in Spain, who controlled access to the Mediterranean. It was politically and strategically important to Napoleon to have Spain. Charles IV, the King of Spain, convinced by Napoleon that the two nations would conquer Portugal together, failed to grasp Napoleon's plan to seize power in Spain, and under the guise of reinforcing the Spanish armies, 25,000 French troops entered Spain unopposed. In 1808, Spanish resistance to Napoleon's armies led to several massacres across Spain, and Goya paints the 3rd of May, 1808. Where most portraits of war at the time depicted noble qualities and stoic figures with theatrical backgrounds and scenery, Goya paints war for what it is: unforgiving death. After the 3rd of May, Napoleon believed that Spain would benefit from rulers who were more progressive and competent, and decided that his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, should be king. And after Charles gave up the throne, Joseph was the king of Spain. Goya was left in a difficult position after the French invasion. He had supported the initial aims of the French Revolution and had hoped its ideals would help liberate Spain from feudalism to become a secular democratic political system. But after visiting many of the battle sites around Madrid to witness the Spanish resistance firsthand, he only described it as the dismemberment of Spain. Goya during this time was still the court painter and was commissioned to paint portraits of the French royals who he felt grossly uncomfortable working for. However, over the course of a decade, Goya would silently create a series of 82 prints titled The Disasters of War. In these prints, the poetic beauty typical of war paintings of the time is gone. What is left are the true aftermaths of war. We see how Goya saw his people, his country, left rotting, scared, and embarrassed. After the Napoleonic Wars and the internal turmoil of the changing Spanish government, Goya developed a resentful attitude toward mankind. He had an acute first-hand awareness of panic, terror, fear, and hysteria. And at the age of 72, Goya decided to exile himself and moved into a 2-story house outside Madrid that was called Quinta del Sordo, Deaf Man's Villa. In 1819, Goya suffered a second serious illness and painted a self-portrait of himself a year later for the compassion and care with which his friend saved his life. It is thought that Goya began to paint the black paintings the following year. These images are 14 of the illustrations Goya painted onto the walls of his home and lived with for his personal amusement. The black paintings are a reflection of his internal struggle with the unapologetic world, its suffering, and the people within it. Goya paints a dog drowning, man's most loyal companion. Here, he shows that loyalty is not always rewarded and that sometimes the loyal are the ones who are drowned. He paints the devil holding a court surrounded by a coven of witches, terrified, but most dramatically, he paints Saturn devouring his son. In Greek mythology, Kronos, and in Roman mythology, Saturn, fearing a prophecy that his children would overthrow him, he swallowed each one at birth, but his wife Rhea saved their youngest, Zeus, who later returned and overthrew him, fulfilling the prophecy. But in Goya's depiction of the Titan, Saturn, hunched and lethargic, eats his child, fully grown into a man, his fingers digging into the spine of his son, who seemingly at his death knew exactly what was going on. The black paintings were never meant to be seen. They were not propaganda or portraits or commission. They were honest. Goya died in exile in 1828. If you'd like to hear more episodes like this, consider checking out the Sophia Patreon at patreon.com/Sophia by Nico.